once the war first started in June of last year and then restarted this more recently, there's been much criticism in the media that Trump has not articulated a coherent reason for the war. And when they're looking for Trump to give a reason, they're looking for a wrong place, actually. Where they should be looking for the reasons is in Tel Aviv, because since 1979 revolution, U.S. presidents, with the one exception I'll get to, is the Obama administration, the administrations in Washington have outsourced basically their Iran policy to Israel, which means basically to Netanyahu. And here, what one has to look for is what is really the policy of Israel in the past and at the present. Now, if you look at the Israeli policy in the long term, there have been very consistently and insistently demanded that Iran should have no nuclear research, no nuclear facilities, no basically knowledge or even a scientist involved in nuclear research. They've been consistent on that. They've been actually very insistent on it. And this has only created a major crisis between Israel and, on one hand, Israel and United States and Iran, because Iran's position has always been they have a right as a self-respecting, independent, sovereign state to have research on nuclear technology. For them, nuclear technology is basically a sign of being modern, being basically a self-respecting state in the modern world. So they've been also very insistent and consistent on this route. They have also paraphrased and added that while they're doing research on nuclear science, they're not interested in nuclear weaponry. So that their idea that they're going to develop a bomb, they have insisted that is not on the books, that's not their intention. They have no desire to have a nuclear bomb. The Israeli position is, yes, but if you have some nuclear knowledge, you can eventually develop a bomb, and therefore that's dangerous. You should have no, basically, nuclear research. And on the whole, American presidents, with the exception of Obama, basically followed the Israeli policy. The attitude in Washington was that we have no embassy there. We don't have much information about Iran. Israel knows what goes on in Iran. If we need any information about Iran, we'll ask the Israelis. They're knowledgeable. They're savvy. They'll tell us what we need to know. So basically, the U.S. has followed the Israeli policy. I'm not saying Israel is so powerful that it forced the United States to follow its policy. It's much more the abdication in Washington of not having a policy. Normally, when you look at governments, like major governments like the United States, when there's a crisis in some area, they will have institutions that have a task force to deal with the crisis. And you would expect a task force on Iran to give advice to the president on what's going on in Iran, what should be the policy. But there has been, except with the period of Obama, basically no State Department facilities, no State Department knowledge, no National Security Council, even in Washington, that knows or is interested in Iran. Maybe there are some people in the Pentagon one doesn't know of, but as far as the CIA is concerned, the State Department is concerned, the National Security Council, it basically has no basic experts on Iran. The few experts that existed under Obama were basically eased out or silenced, so that they're not in the play. So the result is basically policy is made in not in Washington, but in Tel Aviv. And there, Netanyahu persuaded easily Trump that because the Islamic Republic had lost a lot of its popularity, in fact, I would say it lost its legitimacy, especially after mass killings, that this regime was so fragile that a few days of bombing will bring the regime down. And therefore, the problem of so-called existential threat of Iran and going nuclear would be basically solved. And the exception, of course, is the Obama period, where Obama changed U.S. policy and broke from Tel Aviv, where he made the decision that, yes, Iran has the right to have nuclear research on condition that it verifies that it's not doing research for nuclear weaponry. And that was the beauty of the agreement, because if you look at that agreement, it was very concrete, very specific. Netanyahu claimed it was very vague and sort of ambiguous, but in fact, it was 150 pages of very detailed, basically, demands which Iran accepted. A few demands that were actually very concrete is Iran could enrich to the point of 3.67% of uranium. It couldn't be more precise than that. And of course, to have nuclear weaponry, you need something like 90%. And that amount of 3.67% was actually very limited. Anything that Iran produced extra to that had to be exported. Also, on top of that, some of the more advanced centrifuges that Iran had were actually disbanded. And added to that, there were over 100 monitors, international monitors, including American monitors, to make sure that the agreement was implemented. So that was actually a very practical and logical solution to the conflict. Except for Netanyahu refused to accept that, because for him, the idea that Iran even had some nuclear scientists doing research was an existential threat, because that few research could develop into a bomb, and as soon as Iran had the bomb, it would use it on Israel. So it became a second Holocaust image. And I won't go into internal Israeli politics why he used that successfully to scare people in Israel. But the agreement itself was actually a very solid solution to the conflict that existed between basically the two sides. Of course, once Trump withdrew from this agreement at the urging of Netanyahu, that unraveled the situation, and it has led to the present situation of war. And then that was, you could say, inevitable. Once the U.S. withdrew, then Iran counteracted by saying, well, there is no agreement. We can enrich further if we want, and we'll increase until the U.S. comes back to the agreement it had originally signed. So what Netanyahu was willing to sell to Trump was just a few days of bombing, and the whole regime would collapse. And in fact, there was a speech that Trump made on the eve of the new attack on Iran. He said, it is time for the people of Iran, Persians, Kurds, Azaris, Baluchis, and Akhvaris, to shed from themselves the burden of tyranny and bring forth a free and peace-seeking Iran, i.e., he was asking everyone in Iran to rise up against the state and destroy the state. And in this list, actually, it's sort of funny, because the last group he mentions, Akhvaris, I thought I'm an Iran expert. I never heard of them. So I did what most people do, Google to find out who these people were. They happen to be a Sunni group that lives on the other side of the Caucasus in central Russia. So why they appear suddenly among the oppressed minorities in Iran, I leave to your imagination to figure out that one out. Anyway, the notion was that a quick attack on Iran would bring down the regime, and that would solve the problem, or change the regime, or somehow the country would break into a civil war, as happened uh, in Syria. Well, that didn't happen. Even though the regime is despicable, the regime had lost much of its um, legitimacy. It still has its central core, the Revolutionary Guards, and some 15–20% of the population that supports the regime. That was withheld. So the regime did not collapse. In fact, the regime became stronger as a result of the bombing. Why naturally people who, even Iranians who hate the regime, when they see the country is attacked, especially when, almost every university in Iran is bombed by the Israelis, United States. Girls' schools are bombed. Research centers like the Pasteur Institute are bombed. Even Iranians who don't like the regime, they're not going to actually support an Israeli or American war or invasion. So what the war has done, instead of undermining or destroying the regime, is actually strengthened the regime and given it a second wind. It has given it somewhat of a nationalistic legitimacy, which it didn't have before. And this is going to actually create for Iran, the regime, some viability in the short run. I'm not talking about long run. It still has the problem of how to win over the public. But in the short run, as the war continues, it has basically an upper hand in controlling internal situation. Another unexpected result of this war is that Iran has discovered that its real strength is in the Gulf. And means that in future it's going to focus more on the Gulf and less on the Levant. And its influence and power in the Gulf is, in fact, a major trump card to use against the Trump, because controlling the Persian Gulf is actually controlling a great deal of trade, a great deal of oil, gas, fertilizers, and even finance, because in the Persian Gulf states, whether you're looking at Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Arab Emirates, Bahrain, these are very oil, gas rich countries whose income is also feds into into U.S. economy, into Wall Street, and a chokehold, Iranian chokehold on the Gulf actually has international repercussions far beyond the Middle East. It has particular repercussions on the whole capitalist system worldwide, because as oil prices go up, it's gone up from probably about $80 a barrel to 120. It can go up to 150. Some people talking about, if the Gulf keeps on being closed, it could go up to 200. That is going to have incredible repercussions in Wall Street. And what Trump is trying to constantly do is, okay, the war is done, or we're finished, or things will be resolved, in order to soothe the concerns of Wall Street. But that can only work for a certain period of time, because as the crisis continues and the blockade of the Gulf continues, sooner or later things are going to unravel in Wall Street. And that could lead to a recession, which then could escalate into actually an economic depression people are worried about. So what the war has done, in fact, is created for Trump a major crisis when he thought, or he was misconceived, thinking that a short war, a 3-day war, was going to solve the problem. So the question now is, how is he going to get out of this dilemma? And the only way I could see him getting away out of this dilemma is actually accepting the Iranian premise that they have the right to have enrichment with the qualification that they don't go into weaponry, i.e., going back to Obama deal, which was an ideal deal, which Trump, denounced as the worst deal ever made by United States in its history. So he'll have to actually somehow go back to that deal, maybe repackage it and say it's a different deal, it's a new deal, it's a brilliant deal, it's the best deal the US has ever made. But short of that, I don't see this crisis ending. Iran is not going to buckle under. Iran is not going to disappear. And the demand or pressure from Tel Aviv to actually deal with Iran somehow is still going to be there. Also, the question actually often is raised, why is there in Israel such obsession about Iran and the so-called existential threat? And to answer that, one has to go actually to Israeli policy towards the Palestinians. Israel has always had the Palestinian problem since 1948. Originally, the Israeli position, like Golda Meir's position, was there are no Palestinians, there are no such nation. We don't have to deal with it because they don't exist. Well, in due time, almost every country in the world, including the international community, accepted that the Palestinians were a nation, and therefore they had the national rights. So then the Israeli position was that, yes, there are Palestinians, but the Palestinian problem is really kept alive and caused by external forces. First, it was Abdel Nasser in Egypt. Then it was actually the Soviet Union behind the Palestinians. Then it was Saddam Hussein, and then Assad and Gaddafi was the real problem. If they disappeared, the Palestinian issue would also disappear. You may remember one of the selling points about invasion of Iraq was that this was going to be a clear break in Middle East politics. It was going to really solve all issues, especially the Palestinian issue. Well, Saddam Hussein went, Assad went, Gaddafi went. Then it was Iran. Iran was seen as actually the real problem. So if you can get rid of Iran, then the Palestinian issue will basically die down. So that's basically another, I would say, motive for Israel being so obsessed about Iran. Of course, the fact is, even if Iran disappears off the face of the map, the Palestinian issue is still going to be there. And Israel will have to find another actually existential threat. And there's a perfect one existing there. It's actually Turkey. Turkey will be the future existential threat, especially since Erdogan has aspirations of turning Turkey into a new Ottoman Empire right next door to Israel. And Turkey would be a much greater, actually, objective threat to Israel than Iran ever was or is. So the only hope at the moment, I would say, is somehow Trump finds some way of breaking from the Israeli position and repackaging the old Obama agreement without ever mentioning, of course, the name Obama and coming to some sort of settlement with Iran on the nuclear issue. I'll stop there and turn over to Etan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ervand, and thank you everyone for being here. I want to just pick up on one point that Ervand mentioned, discussing um, just the general concern or lack or manufactured concern over an existing Iranian nuclear weapon. Um, as of last week, on May 4th, for the first time in United States history, actually, a group of 30 lawmakers led by Representative Joaquin Castro authored a letter acknowledging the only country in the Middle East that does have nuclear weapons, and it is Israel. And for so long, uh, the United States has actually been aware of the fact that Israel has somewhere now between 90 and 400, we don't know exactly how many, nuclear weapons. And this was a landmark shift in breaking of one of the most long-held taboos in U.S. foreign policy history, and those lawmakers directly tied their mention of this to the current war, and in an apparent attempt to uh, break the ridiculous nature of Trump's constant claim that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. They've agreed to not have a nuclear weapon, and if we are indeed concerned about nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, I think that's an important step forward. But I want to shift gears a little bit and try and just speak about what some of the broad anti-war demands have been from both my organization NIAC and the large coalition of groups who have been paying attention to these issues, like Brooklyn for Peace and others in New York. I even have a prop to show some of you. I have a T-shirt that we passed out to folks. This is 2 years ago. We organized a trip of New Yorkers down to DC, and we gave these out. And the demands are largely similar. It's no weapons for war crimes, no war on Iran, because we knew at the time in the unfolding genocide in Gaza that war with Iran was next, um, and to restore UNRWA funding and to deliver aid. But those demands, if for activists who pay attention to this work so closely, have been very clear, and it's a real shame that so many leaders have failed to hear them, and at least now. Um, Perhaps for the right reasons, perhaps for political reasons, with an election coming up in November, the Democratic Party is beginning to attempt to embrace some of those demands. And to dive, I think, more specifically into what those demands are right now for the community, I'm going to share my screen and go into the first one. Um, so this is a uh, the first thing that I think that we should recognize is that the U.S. Congress does have the authority and the ability to stop the war now by
Aton,
passing an Iran.
we can't see your screen.
Oh,
We just
I'll just stop sharing. I'll just talk then. That's okay. I'll share some of these things after. But the first thing that the U.S. Congress can do right now to stop the war is by passing an Iran war powers resolution. As stated in the Congress in the Constitution, the US Congress and the American people are the bodies that decide when our country engages in war. And it was laughable to me last week on May 5th, our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, uh, called the War Powers Act unconstitutional. And if you go back even to the authors of the Constitution, James Madison um, wrote under a pseudonym, Helvidius, in 1793 during debates with Hamilton. He wrote extensively about the need for war powers to be vested in the people and not a tyrant. I'm going to read you a quote. He said, "In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislator and not to the executive department. Beside the objection to such a mixture to heterogeneous powers, the trust and temptation would be too great for any one man." And clearly, that temptation has been too much for Trump to resist in distracting from his failed policies on immigration and the economy, and now dragging us into war on Iran, and that is uh, frustrating. But there is, for whatever the motivations may be, there is hope to hold on to politically. And the latest War Powers resolution vote, as of today, inched closer and closer to passage. The latest vote um, read was marked down at 49 to 50, and saw three Republicans switch. And more Republicans are being asked in town hall after town hall, when they come home, with gas prices, with oil prices, with diesel prices, for especially affecting farmers, and the closing of the strait affecting fertilizer. They're being pressed on this issue.